Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to discuss my amendment number 1521 to fence all funding above $50.9 billion in the account for overseas contingency operations until budget caps on both defense and non-defense have been raised. My amendment specifically recognizes the need for these resources, but it objects to the way that this OCO fund is being used as a way to circumvent the Budget Control Act. And it does so, I think, on very sound grounds that over the long run will be beneficial to the Department of Defense and to everyone who's engaged in defense of the United States. You know, Mr. President, we debate and vote on many issues in the Senate, and while all the issues are important, occasionally we must face an issue that cruelly could change the course of our nation. Because the consequences of our actions here are often not known for years, the votes may be very difficult when they are taken, but they are very, very important. One example of such an issue is Iraq. 13 years ago, the majority of the body, 79 senators from both parties, voted to go to war in Iraq. I did not vote in favor of the war. In fact, I spoke against it. And I think the outcome could have been very different back then if we had more of a debate about the true cost and the long-term cost, the thousands of lives lost, the countless wounded, some with invisible scars. If we had thought that the United States would be on a war footing for over a decade and American taxpayers would be on the hook for trillions of dollars, and that we would perhaps even contribute by our actions to new threats that we are facing today. Back then, it was implied, sometimes stated, that opposing the Iraq war meant you didn't support the troops or were weak on national security. And I think the intervening years have shown that to be inaccurate. But we're hearing echoes of that rhetoric again. If you don't support this version of the NDAA, then you don't support the troops, or terms like taking this bill hostage. And that's just not the case. Since 2005, Senate Republicans voted against cloture on the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Bill, 10 times. And over that same period, they cast votes against final passage of the NDAA on the Senate floor 8 times. Sometimes it was because of policy differences, like ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Other times it was over things like gas prices at the pump or other issues. But I don't think anyone's ever done it to be unpatriotic. We can't change history, but we can certainly learn from it. We can't see into the future, but we know we must plan for it. And we must pay for it by making strategic investments today. And this debate really boils down to this: what's the most effective way to provide for our national defense? And I don't think inflating the overseas contingency account, OCO, is the way to go, because it complicates rather than helps the Pentagon's budgetary problems. It doesn't allow the military to effectively plan for the future. We need to replace the senseless sequester with a balanced approach that keeps America safe and strong at home and abroad. And when it comes to the defense budget, Congress should adhere to the same standards of honesty, transparency, and discipline that we demand for our troops. But right now, there's a serious disconnect in the OCO mechanism of this bill, and Congress needs to step up and fix it. The President's fiscal year 2016 budget request for defense was $38 billion above the 2011 Budget Control Act, the BCA, their spending caps. The President requested this $38 billion be authorized and appropriated as part of the annual base budget, so they could be part of the Defense Department's funding, not just for 1 year, as OCO is, but in the budget for an indefinite period of time. The request also contained $50.9 billion for the OCO account, meaning funding for truly war-related expenses and not enduring base budget requirements. However, this bill, following the lead of the majority's budget resolution, does not address the BCA's damaging impacts on defense and non-defense. Instead, it turns to a gimmick. This bill initially transferred $39 billion from the base budget request of the president to the OCO budget, leaving a base budget conveniently below the BCA levels in order to avoid triggering automatic reductions through sequestration. The funding shifted to OCO is for enduring requirements of the military services, not direct war-related costs, not those costs generated in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. It includes flying hours for aircraft, steaming days for ships and submarines, all training that supports current and future training in support of the national military strategy. These are not OCO expenses. These are the expenses of the Department of Defense facing the long-term challenges of the United States and maintaining the long-term capabilities of the United States Defense Forces. Now, some have said that we should avoid subjecting defense spending to the budget control caps through this OCO approach for a year, while a deal to revise or eliminate the BCA caps is negotiated. I couldn't disagree more, because if we use this approach, this gimmick, for 1 year, it will be easier to do it next year, and the year after, and the year after that, ensuring an enduring imbalance between security and domestic spending. Using OCO in this way is completely counter to the intent of the BCA, the Budget Control Act. The BCA imposed proportionally equal cuts to defense and non-defense discretionary spending to force a bipartisan compromise. This approach unilaterally reneges on that bipartisan approach. Rather than generating momentum for a permanent solution to sequestration, this approach essentially exempts defense spending from the BCA caps and releases all pressure to find a solution that provides similar relief for domestic spending priorities. The President's defense budget request placed the needed funding in the base where it should be and provided for the OCO funds for contingencies overseas that exist today. The budget resolution and the bill before us met the President's request for overall funding. This is not a question whether the President asked for a certain amount of money and my Republican colleagues are asking for more. What they did is essentially said, we're going to not technically, and I emphasize technically, violate the BCA account. We're just going to move more money into OCO. And so we can stand up with a straight face and say, well, BCA applies across the whole board. Every government agency is subject to the same tight limits that the Budget Control Act imposes. But of course, the truth is, through the use of OCO, that doesn't apply to the Department of Defense. And it's particularly startling when you look at the President's request for domestic agencies. He asked for $37 billion for all the other domestic agencies above the BCA caps. And without that money, they're going to have a very difficult, indeed perhaps impossible challenge of meeting the basic needs of the American public. Needs that every colleague in this chamber recognizes. Some might disagree with them, but they recognize that we need to support education as we've done for decades through the Title I program. We need to support people, our seniors particularly, through senior housing programs. In every state and every community, that has to be done. But if we follow this path, it'll be harder and harder for non-defense agencies to do this. And so what we've created is a huge loophole from the BCA for defense. And again, let me remind you, the President and my colleagues on the side are not arguing about the resources necessary to defense. They've picked the same number. But what they're done on the other side is funded that not straightforwardly, not recognizing that we have to deal with the BCA, by using this, and I say again, this gimmick. And if it remains in the bill, I believe this approach will be a magnet for non-defense spending in future years. Not only will we become addicted to OCO spending, many, many interesting things will find their way into the OCO accounts. For example, in fiscal year 1992, Congress added funds to the defense bill for breast cancer research. At the time, discretionary spending was subject to statutory caps under the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. This was the follow-on to the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act of 1985. What we had done is establish caps on discretionary domestic spending, but there were no similar caps on the other side. And that's precisely what the effect of this proposal is today. The initial funding led to the establishment of the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. Every senator is familiar with this important program. I would suspect every senator has stood and said, yay, that research on breast cancer is so important. That research on other diseases is so critical and so important. It has strong bipartisan support, and each fiscal year, Congress authorizes and appropriates hundreds of millions of dollars to the CDMRP for cutting-edge and critically essential medical research areas. In fact, since 1992, CDMRP funding has received over $13 billion. And while this program is funded through the Annual Defense Bill and the program is managed by the Army, the Department of Defense does not execute any of the money itself. It is a competitive grant process, and proposals are subject to stringent peer and programmatic review criteria. DoD is a pass-through because back then, the only way you could get this done was because there were no caps effectively on defense spending, and I would suggest that that is going to repeat itself over and over again if we start on this path. And that's why we can look today and say we have these pressing crises all across the globe, and it is true. But if we go down this path, we will see these types of developments. And again, I'm a strong supporter of medical research. These programs have saved countless lives. I will support this funding in this bill. I think it is a way that we've established to deal with the program, but we should recognize it came about not because it was the most logical place to place medical research funding. It was a budgetary expedient, just like this approach today. And it will be replicated. And looking forward 10 years, I would suggest that you'll see lots of meritorious programs that bear less and less connectivity to our overseas operations, included in OCO, if that's the way we choose to get around the BCA, and that's what this legislation is doing. There's another point that has to be made. Moving this funding from the base to OCO has no impact on reducing the deficit. OCO and emergency funding are outside budget caps for a reason. They are for the cost of ongoing military operations or respond to other unforeseen events like natural disasters. To subtly ignore the true purpose of OCO and treat it as a budgetary gimmick or slush fund to skirt the BCA is unacceptable use for this important tool for our warfighters. Just to highlight how this OCO approach skews defense spending, consider the amount of OCO in relation to the number of deployed troops. If you ask someone, I think, on the street, well, these overseas funds, they're used to support our forces overseas. There's got to be some relationship between the number of our forces overseas and our OCO spending. Well, let's see. In 2008, at the height of our nation's troop commitment in Iraq and Afghanistan, 187,000 troops deployed. We spent approximately $1 million in OCO funding for every service member deployed to those countries. Under this bill, we would expend approximately $9 million in OCO for every service member deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, roughly 9,930 military personnel. So we're doing a lot more than spending for OCO in this bill. Deliberately, a lot more. We are doing what we used to do and what we should do in the base budget of the Department of Defense. It circumvents the law, the BCA. It's not fiscally responsible, and it's not an honest accounting to the American public. If years ago, with 187,000 troops, our OCO costs were about $1 million a troop, and now they're $9 million, something is askew. And adding to the funds to OCO does not solve, in some cases, complicates the DoD's budgetary problems. As the Army Chief of Staff, General Odierno, said, in his words, OCO has limits and it has restrictions and it has very strict rules that have to be followed. And so if we're inhibited by that, it might not help us. What might happen at the end of the year, we have a bunch of money we hand back because we are not able to spend it. Defense budgeting needs to be based on our long-term military strategy, which requires the DoD to focus at least 5 years in the future. A 1 year plus up to OCO does not provide DoD with the certainty and stability it needs when building its 5-year budget. As General Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, testified, we need to fix the base budget. We won't have the certainty we need if there is a year-by-year OCO fix. Defense Secretary Carter added that raising OCO does not allow the Defense Department to plan efficiently or strategically. Adding funds to OCO is a managerially unsound approach to what should be a multi-year budget process. According to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Allen, the current restrictions on the employment of OCO will not allow it to be a gap filler that is currently being proffered to offset the reduction in our base budget that is driven by the current proposals that are before Congress. In order to meet the needs of our Army, it must have greater flexibility. It must be less restrictive, and it must enable us to sustain and modernize as we go forward. This instability undermines the morale of our troops and their families who want to know their futures are planned for more than 1 year at a time. And the confidence of our defense industry partners we rely on to provide the best technology available to our troops are also tested. Abuse of OCO in this massive way risks undermining support for a critical mechanism used to fund the incremental cost of overseas conflicts. We have to have a disciplined system for estimating the cost and funding the employment of a trained, ready force. The administration has indicated that legislation implementing the majority's budget framework will be subject to veto. As Secretary Carter said, this approach is clearly a road to nowhere. I say this because President Obama has already made clear that he won't accept a budget that locks in sequestration going forward, as this approach does, and he won't accept a budget that severs the vital link between our national security and our economic security. And when you talk about national security, true national security requires that non-DoD departments and agencies also receive relief from BCA caps. The Pentagon simply cannot meet the complex set of national security challenges without the help of other governmental departments and agencies, including state, justice, and homeland security. In the Armed Services Committee, we have heard testimony on the essential role of other government agencies in ensuring our national defense remains strong. The Defense Department's share of the burden would surely grow if these agencies are not adequately funded as well. There is a symbiotic relationship between the Department of Defense and other civilian departments and agencies that contribute to our national security. It has to be recognized that a truly whole-of-government approach requires more than just a strong DoD. The BCA caps are based on a misnomer that discretionary spending is divided into security and non-security spending. But members need to be clear. Essential national security functions are performed by governmental agencies and departments other than the Defense Department. According to the commander of U.S. Southern Command, General Kelly, we do not and cannot do this mission alone. Our strong partnerships with the U.S. interagency, especially with the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Departments of Treasury and State are integral to our efforts to ensure the forward defense of the U.S. homeland. And as retired Marine Corps General Mattis said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. General Mattis' point is perhaps best illustrated in the administration's 9 lines of effort to counter the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, which 83% of Americans think is the #1 threat to the United States. Of the administration's 9 lines of effort, only 2, which are security and intelligence, fall squarely within the responsibilities of the Department of Defense and intelligence community. The remaining 7 elements of our counter-ISIL strategy rely heavily on our civilian departments and agencies. For example, 1, supporting effective governments in Iraq. No amount of military assistance to the government of Iraq will be effective in countering the ISIL threat in Iraq if the Abadi government does not govern in a more transparent and inclusive manner that gives Sunnis hope that they will participate politically in Iraq's future. We need our diplomatic and political experts at the State Department to engage with Sunni, Shia, Kurd, and minority communities in Iraq to promote reconciliation and build a political unity among the Iraqi people needed to defeat ISIL. And that is not a strictly Defense Department initiative. We have to build partner capacity. The coalition is building the capabilities and capacity of our partners in the region to wage a long-term campaign against ISIL. While the efforts to build the capacity of the Iraqi security forces and some of our other foreign partners are funded by the Defense Department, the State Department and USAID are also responsible for billions of dollars in similar activities and across a broader spectrum of activities. Under the Republican plan, none of the state and USAID programs will be plussed up. Their unwillingness to address this gap is a threat to our nation's efforts to combat ISIL. We have to disrupt ISIL's finances. ISIL's expansion has given it access to significant and diverse sources of funding. Countering ISIL's financing will require the State Department and the Treasury Department to work with their foreign partners and banking sector to ensure that our counter-ISIL sanctions regime is implemented and enforced. These state and Treasury-led efforts are essentially deemed non-security activities under BCA caps, and under the Republican approach, our efforts to disrupt the finance of ISIL may be hampered. It's also notable that the Office of Foreign Asset Control and the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence in the Treasury Department are also categorized as non-security activities under BCA caps. The Republican funding strategy not only means that our counter-ISIL efforts will be hampered, so too will our efforts to impose effective sanctions against Iran, Sudan, and individuals who support their illicit activities will also be effective. And we have to continually expose the true and brutal nature of ISIL. Our strategic communications command against ISIL requires a truly whole-of-government effort, including State Department, Voice of America, USAID. The Republican approach to funding our strategic communications strategy is part of government plan, not a whole-of-government plan. We have to disrupt foreign fighters. They are the lifeblood of ISIL, yet key components of the Department of Homeland Security would be facing cuts under the Republican budget proposals, undermining efforts to disrupt the flow of foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq. And while the efforts of our diplomats around the world prodding our foreign partners to pass laws or more effectively enforce the laws on their books, the efforts of the coalition to stem the flow of foreign fighters will never be successful. My colleague, Senator McCain, pointed out the huge refugee crisis. Again, our first agency typically to respond to refugees is USAID, United States Agency for International Development, and other State Department agencies. We won't be able to deal with that issue if those budget caps are imposed upon USAID and other agencies. And these refugee camps are one of the breeding grounds for the foreign fighters that flow back into the conflict zone. And so unless we adopt a much broader approach, unless we do something other than simply plus up defense, we will not, I think, achieve true national security. And of course, we have to protect the homeland. While a small portion of the Department of Homeland Security is considered security related under the BCA, the vast majority of the department falls under the non-security BCA cap. This further demonstrates that the Republican plan is a misnomer. It's an effort to play a game of smoke and mirrors with the American public. The DS, the agents of the Department of Homeland Security that are on guard, the DEA agents, the drug enforcement agents that pick up intelligence about threats to the nation, all of them vitally contribute to our national security, but they will be treated distinctly different if we adopt the approach that is inherent in this defense authorization bill. And I talked about the refugee crisis. Virtually none of the activities that support our humanitarian efforts in the region are considered security activities. Military commanders will routinely tell you that the efforts of state, USAID, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance are critical to our broader security efforts, and this is particularly true in the counter-ISIL campaign. Again, those refugees that are flooding into the countries adjacent to Syria and to Iraq, they have to be dealt with not only on humanitarian grounds, but also as potential sources of foreign fighters, and that's going to require a whole-of-government approach, not simply using OCO to beef up our defense spending. Taken together, the Republican plan could compromise our broader campaign against ISIL and deprive significant elements of our government of the resources needed to do the job to protect the American people. The men and women of our military volunteer to protect this nation and are overseas fighting for our ideals, including good education, economic opportunity, safe communities. Efforts to support all these goals will be hampered unless civilian department and agencies also receive relief from the BCA cap. I had the privilege of commanding a paratrooper company at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and we fought for many reasons, but including it was to give people a chance in this country, not just to protect them from a foreign threat, but to give them real opportunities here. And by the way, our service members and their families rely on many of the services provided by non-DoD departments and agencies. For example, the Department of Education administers impact aid to local school districts where children of service members go to learn. The Department of Agriculture supports the school lunch program, which soldiers and their children and their families benefit from. The National Institutes of Health support life-saving medical research, including by contributing to advanced efforts on traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, and suicide prevention. The Department of Health and Human Services run Medicare, providing health care for retirees and disabled individuals, and Medicaid, which provides service to parents, including military parents with children with special needs. And failing to provide BCA cap relief to non-DoD departments and agencies would also shortchange veterans who receive employment services, transition assistance, and housing and homelessness support. Not only is this a sort of a function of failing to support potentially our servicemen through schooling and through other aspects, our national security is also inherently tied to our economic security. Secretary Carter made this very clear. He said the approach that is being proposed disregards the enduring long-term connection between our nation's security and many other factors. Factors like scientific R&D to keep up our technological edge, education of future all-volunteer military force, and the general economic strength of our country. Where will we get the soldiers of the future that have the skills and the training and the expertise if we are underinvesting in a basic education for all of our citizens? My amendment would keep the pressure on for a permanent solution to BCA caps and sequestration by requiring that the BCA caps be eliminated or increased in proportionally equal amounts for both security and non-security spending before the additional OCO funds are available for obligation or expenditure. Let me again emphasize, we are not taking away these funds. We simply say what I think makes a great deal of sense. Until we develop an approach to BCA that allows us to provide for a comprehensive defense of the nation and to invest in the economic health of the nation, then these funds will be reserved. Once we do that, then automatically all the funding that is inherent in this bill becomes available to the Department of Defense. We have heard colleagues on both sides of the aisle talk for years now about the need to resolve the BCA, to end sequestration. Every uniformed service member that came before, every chief of service said the number one priority is end sequestration, end the BCA. This bill doesn't do it. It sidesteps the issue. We can no longer sidestep the issue. We have to engage on this issue. We have to move, I think, promptly and thoroughly and thoughtfully forward to resolve the BCA. The legislation I propose recognizes the need for these resources, but recognizes, I think, the overarching issue. Unless we are able to effectively modify or eliminate the BCA, our comprehensive national security will be threatened, our economic progress will be threatened, our aspirations for the country could be thwarted. My amendment seeks to implement, by the way, a sense of the Senate that is already in the bill. And it clearly states sequestration relief should include equal defense and non-defense relief. We have made, and I commend the chairman for this, a statement without a effective means of implementation, but a statement, an aspirational goal that we should fix BCA and relieve defense and non-defense relief, non-defense spending. And I think that's an important statement, but my amendment makes sure that we go further and provide an action-forcing device to do this. I believe very strongly in this amendment. I believe it's relevant for consideration on this bill. I believe it goes to the heart of the most important question we face in the country today, is how do we essentially provide for the defense, the comprehensive defense of the nation? How do we invest in our people so that we will continue to be strong? And I think if we do not provide this type of mechanism to start this discussion on the BCA and hopefully promptly complete it, then we will be missing not only a historic opportunity, we'll be locking ourselves into a road that will lead us less secure in the future, less productive, less strong as a nation. Let me remind people that the stated purpose of the bill is, quote, to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2016 for military activities of the Department of Defense. And we have to begin this appropriation process by recognizing that the BCA will not help us going forward, and we must move to modify or repeal it. And with that, I would close simply by saying, again, if we continue these caps forward, it'll harm our military readiness. Our national defense should be based upon the needs, the long-term needs. They should be reflected in a transparent, forthright budget that puts the money in the base, provides a contingency fund for true contingencies overseas, but doesn't turn things upside down and make our contingency funding really the heart of the bill in so many respects. We have to work together. We have to make sure that every federal agency can benefit, because every federal agency contributes to the country. So I strongly urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment, to begin this dialogue, and to move forward. The sooner the better. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.